Shalom. All praises to Yahweh Ba'ashem Yahweh Shai, and double honors to the apostles and elders of Great Millstone. May Yahweh Ba'ashem Yahweh Shai's peace be bestowed unto you, hopefully elect. I'm your brother Yahweh Call from Great Millstone, Orlando, and just back with another video, just going into the de-dollarization and how, overall, America is on its way out, man. Just more info on how, again, the dollar, how it's losing its purchasing power. The dollar's getting weak. In turn, it's going to lead to, as we've been bringing it out from the apostles and the elders of Great Millstone, while Jake is out here playing around, playing games, not sounding not blowing the correct trumpet, sounding the correct alarm, standing on our tower and whatnot, and warning the people of what's coming. Because one way or the other, prophecy is going to play out. And we see all the recipes for disaster being cooked up, all the ingredients. So, again, just more information dealing with how the dollar is losing its purchasing power. Esau, he has to do something dramatic, and he has to do it quick. So, fair use, copyright disclaimer. I'm not making any type of monetary gain off this video. This is just for informational purposes. Lord willing, I'm going to play through this whole video. It's pretty informative. So without further ado,
I want to begin today's video by explaining to you what de-dollarization is. And for that, I brought a prop. Do you know what this is? It's a fuzzy pen. So what's this valued at? Let's just say it's worth $5. Maybe you can get it for $3. Maybe you can get it for $10. Let's just go with $5. Okay, but what if the U.S. government told all the producers and manufacturers of these fuzzy pens that you have to stop making these because the U.S. government is now going to be the sole producer of these? And the government also tells you, me, all Americans, that we must obtain these fuzzy pens, and failure to do so will result in you going to prison. So in that scenario, what's going to happen to the value of these fuzzy pens? The value is going to shoot up because there's going to be much more demand for these fuzzy pens, right? That makes sense. Okay. It's the same thing with this. What is this? This is just cotton and linen. You can call this a piece of paper. What's the intrinsic value of this? It's zero. It's nothing. This is, again, just cotton and linen. It's a fiat currency backed by nothing. But why is this so valuable? It's because there's so much demand for this. Okay, why? Because if you don't obtain this, you're either going to end up in prison or you're going to end up in the streets. Okay, so what am I talking about? Going to prison. Have you heard of Wesley Snipes? You don't pay your taxes, you're going to end up in prison or in jail. I mean, you don't pay your property taxes with these. What's going to happen? They're going to take away your home. You don't pay your auto loan with these. What's going to happen? They're going to take away your vehicle. So ultimately what's going on is that U.S. dollars have value because there's big demand for U.S. dollars. Now, I want to bring this to your attention. If you want to buy oil in the Mideast, then you need to buy it with dollars. It's the petrodollar system, and that creates big demand for U.S. dollars. Governments and central banks, they want to store their savings, they want to store their reserves in U.S. dollars as well. And that creates big demand for dollars as well. But what if oil started to be sold in other currencies outside the dollar? What if governments and central banks didn't want to save or hold their reserves in dollars? Then there would be much less demand for dollars. And if there's less demand for dollars, then the value of the dollar will fall. And if the value of the dollar falls, then it's going to require more devalued dollars to buy anything because they're going to be worth less because there's less demand for them. And then what's going to happen? Well, in that case, inflation's going to go up, interest rates are going to go up, and I guarantee you that average wages for Americans are not going to keep up, and the standard of living for Americans will go down. And this is occurring right now in plain sight, and the majority of Americans are clueless. Here's what you need to know. Right now, countries around the world are actively trying to move away from the U.S. dollar, which means less demand for dollars. This process is called de-dollarization, and I want you to know that it's a process. It's not an event. Okay, why should you care? You have to understand that the value of the dollar doesn't just affect the U.S. government. The value of the dollar affects all Americans through inflation, interest rates, your investments, and of course the cost of living. If the dollar weakens, then all that's going to become worse. So most Americans take this privilege of a strong dollar for granted. Unfortunately, again, this privilege is being stripped from us right under our noses little by little. And as time goes on and countries de-dollarize, even more, most Americans will become noticeably poorer. So there's actually a way to protect yourself and your family from de-dollarization, which I'm going to be happy to share with you in this video. And I just want to say that, okay, if you don't want to take my advice, fine, be my guest. All I can tell you is, well, in that case, if you want to be stubborn like that, I'll just say have fun in the future being stressed about money constantly and being miserable and having a bad attitude and watching life just pass you by. Because you did nothing to defend yourself against the government's plan of financial slavery. Now, I want to show you this. Foreign central banks hold U.S. treasuries in their reserves. You can think of these essentially as dollars because it's a huge component to the dollar ecosystem. As of early 2026, gold has overtaken U.S. treasuries as the world's largest central bank reserve asset for the first time in 30 years, marking a historic shift. So central banks now hold roughly $4 trillion in gold, surpassing the $3.9 trillion held in U.S. treasuries. So do you see what's happening? Demand that was previously going towards dollars in U.S. treasuries are now shifting towards gold. Okay, a very good question is, why is this happening? Why do central banks want to hold fewer U.S. treasuries or dollars? In other words, diversify away from the dollar. And I'll tell you for many reasons, but I'll give you the top reasons. So the first one is the weaponization of the U.S. dollar. 2, fiscal irresponsibility by the U.S. governments. And 3, money printing by the Federal Reserve. Now, let me share with you how the weaponization of the U.S. dollar is incentivizing other countries to move away from the U.S. dollar. One of the biggest turning points in this entire conversation happened back in 2022. After Russia invaded Ukraine, the United States and its allies imposed massive sanctions on Russia. And one of the most significant actions was this. The United States of America and allies froze a large portion of Russia's foreign exchange reserves. So we're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars of Russia's money. Like these reserves were, of course they belonged to Russia, but they were held in Western financial institutions, including dollar-denominated assets. And once those reserves were frozen, Russia effectively lost access to them. Now, from a policy standpoint, this was meant to apply economic pressure on Russia, right? But from a global perspective, this sent a very clear message to other countries. And the message was, if your assets are held in dollars, then they can be frozen. So it's actually a big risk for other countries and central banks to trust in the dollar, because if they don't submit to the U.S., then their dollars can be confiscated with a simple keystroke. Now, let's talk about the fiscal irresponsibility of the U.S. government and the massive amount of money printing by the Federal Reserve.
So, as I've said yesterday, been saying on this channel, while these type of things are going on right under people's noses, more specifically these Babylonians, they have no idea. Meanwhile, these nations, they see things like this. They see what's going on. And what does it do? Because again, Babylon has weaponized the dollar for so long. These nations, they've found out ways to work around the system. So this is why, again, we're in this process of de-dollarization as we speak. You got something called the M-Bridge, right? And as you just mentioned, central banks, they are pretty much stacking up on gold. You've got the BRICS pay, right? All these different systems that work around this dollar. So again, these nations, because America's doing this to its own allies. Right now, the EU is catching hell due to this whole so-called Middle Eastern conflict. All right. Certain EU countries, man, they're catching hell pretty much, you see. And, everyone at this point, man, is more and more pointing at the same common denominator. All right. Babylon.
Listen, if another country buys U.S. treasuries, that's essentially other countries lending money to the U.S. governments. Again, a big component of the dollar ecosystem. And the U.S. government needs money. Like this year, the government's going to collect about $5 trillion in taxes. So you can think of that as the government's income. And the government's going to spend about $7 trillion. So bring in 5 and spend 7. Okay, so how do you do that? How do you spend $7 trillion when you earn $5 trillion? The answer is that you borrow the difference. The government's going to sell treasuries, which are basically IOUs. I just want you to take a look at how much the national debt has been growing over the past few years. Thanks to negligent overspending by the U.S. government. Like, to me, it's actually quite disturbing. Like, this is up to fiscal year.
So mind you, Babylon is they're losing buyers for these treasuries. And when you get into it, when this shit spills over 144 times over, it's going to be catastrophic, man. It's going to be crazy. Because you can only pay debt with debt for so long. Eventually, because this is what Babylon is doing. They're kicking the can down the road. But as we say, eventually the road is coming to an end. The road is going to come to an end. And we're coming to the end of this road.
2025. And now the U.S. government is in debt $39 trillion. And I want to ask you this simple math question. How long is it going to take to pay back $39 trillion when you overspend by $2 trillion a year? And the answer is never. The situation has gotten so bad that there's not enough buyers of U.S. treasuries. There's not enough demand. That's why the Federal Reserve has been printing money to make up the difference. So when you have this fiscal irresponsibility combined with money printing, it makes other countries trust less in the U.S. dollar system. So sure, if they buy U.S. treasuries, they're going to get paid back with some interest. However, they're getting paid back with devalued dollars. Okay, so if other countries and central banks are moving away from dollars, then what are they doing with their savings and their trade surpluses? So instead of getting dollars to buy U.S. treasuries, they've been heavily purchasing gold, like physical gold, and I showed you the chart of how much it's grown by. Now, let's talk about the U.S. dollar in global trade. But before we go any further, let's be realistic about this. Despite all these developments, the U.S. dollar is still the dominant global currency, right? Wow. So the majority of global trade still involves the dollar. Most commodities are still priced in dollars. However, as I told you earlier, de-dollarization is a process. It's not an event. And the de-dollarization process is in progress. Here's what we're seeing.
So like you said, because it's a process, it's not an event, but there's going to be an event, because again, things are going to get so chaotic when the chickens come home to roost, right? It's like I said that wrong, but when they come home to roost, all right. Again, there's going to be an event, some sort of an event, which we are again standing on our watchtower, sounding the alarm. All right. We are on the lookout for this event. There's all type of narratives out there. And make no mistake about it, because all this is a controlled demolition. All right. These elites behind scenes, they're, having certain conversations and councils and things of that nature. It's all a controlled demolition at the end of the day. But nevertheless, there is going to be some sort of an event, because they have to switch over to this new system, this new way of buying and selling.
We're seeing more bilateral trade agreements being settled in local currencies outside of the dollar. We're seeing countries experimenting with alternative payment systems as well. Now, none of these are going to replace the dollar overnight, but it does gradually reduce its share. And over time, this is going to have real consequences. And I just want to say this. The sad part is that the U.S. government is accelerating the process of de-dollarization. Okay, what am I referring to? I'm talking about the sanctions and the geopolitics, abusive implementation, and bad policies, which is making the situation even worse. For example, I want you to take a look at what happened in Russia. The war between Ukraine and Russia, it's really a proxy war. It's really the United States against Russia. Well, I guess you could say the U.S. and allies against Russia. So the U.S.'s strategy was to sanction Russia to isolate their economy and financially devastate their country, right? Like that was the goal. And while sanctions did have an impact, Russia adapted. It increased their trade with other countries, it shifted transactions into other currencies, and it built alternative financial pathways. Now, again, this doesn't mean that sanctions failed entirely, but it does show that countries can adjust. And that adjustment often involves reducing reliance on the U.S. dollar. So our master plan actually backfired, and it accelerated de-dollarization. And I'm sure you're not oblivious to this. Just take a look at what's happening in Iran. The war in Iran is a war of choice. They never attacked us. They don't have nukes. The U.S. government wanted regime change, right? And it's also a proxy war against China because most of that oil from Iran, about 90% of that goes to China. And these oil transactions, they're getting done in yuan, which is very upsetting to the U.S. governments. And why is this upsetting to the U.S. governments? Okay, so here's how the dollar system works. If Iran sold their oil in U.S. dollars, then with those dollars that they earned, they would take those dollars and they would invest it into U.S. treasuries. But what's happening in Iran? Iran is selling their oil to China. Iran is getting paid in yuan, and with those yuan, Iran is buying Chinese goods. Okay, so what are they buying from China? They're buying machinery, manufacturing equipment, weapons, electronics, vehicles, chemicals, pharmaceuticals, steel, solar panels, etc. And of course, the U.S. government doesn't like this. The U.S. government wants that money for the U.S. So the goal was regime change, have Iran price their oil in dollars, and with those dollars, Iran would buy American products, invest in the U.S. stock market, and most importantly, buy U.S. treasuries.
And all this is coming back to bite Babylon in the ass.
However, Iran refuses to cooperate and submit to the U.S. I just want you to know that historically, oil has been priced and traded in U.S. dollars. So that's a major reason why global demand for dollars has remained strong. But now we're starting to see changes. Multiple countries are exploring energy trade in Chinese yuan, in local currencies, and alternative settlement systems. But even small shifts in energy markets matter because energy is one of the largest global markets. And if more transactions move outside the dollar, then that's going to reduce demand for dollars. Additionally, I want to take a look at what Iran is doing. The toll that they're charging is in Chinese yuan, not U.S. dollars. That's why the U.S. is pretty upset right now. Now, a very good question is, how do we judge the progress of de-dollarization? And I would say that the best indicator is the U.S. Treasury markets. When countries trade in dollars, they accumulate all these dollars, and then they use those dollars to buy U.S. Treasuries. So if all the countries are transacting in dollars, there's going to be big demand for U.S. Treasuries. And that's going to give us lower interest rates, which it has been. And of course, lower interest rates are good for the U.S. government because they borrow money, and that's good for Americans that need to take out whatever type of loan, whether it be a mortgage or an auto loan or student loans or credit cards, etc. Okay, I just want to say this. If you're still not following along.
So, and I will add on to that point, how do we know that the de-dollarization process is being sped up? Well, just go to the grocery store. Just live in Babylon. The price of everything is going up. Inflation. Right? Everyone's crying out because shit is just expensive. More and more is Esau making it just impossible. I'm gonna grab this real quick in Leviticus 26. And Leviticus 26:19, and I will break the pride of your power, and I will make your heaven as iron and your earth as brass. So as the saying goes, being stuck between a rock and a hard place, everyone's feeling the effects. How do we know that this is becoming a more and more common thing? Well, again, everyone's feeling the effects. I just say this too as a sidebar. Get ready for Isaiah 4:1. All right. In effect, verse 26. And when I have broken the staff of your bread, 10 women shall bake your bread in one oven, and they shall deliver you your bread again by weight, and you shall eat and not be satisfied. So, again, man, as sidebar, get ready for Isaiah 4:1. I've been seeing this trend where, women, man, they're starting to share, man. It's just easier for everyone. It's becoming more logical to just say, instead of, getting all but hurt, about a man cheating on you, so-called cheating on you, why not just bring the broad in, and y'all live together and put the resources together, right? Because that's what it's, again, coming to more and more. It's just logical, So, get ready for that.
Long. like how all this works, I want to explain it to you like this. Let's just say that Michael Jordan announces, like he says, I need some people to lend me some money. Okay, in that case, I guarantee you there's going to be big demands to lend him money because some people just love Jordan, or they would do it in hopes to meet Jordan or for whatever reason. So you're going to have people saying, Jordan, I'll lend you money at a good rate. I'll lend you money, you just got to pay me a 4% interest rate. And someone else will be like, no, Jordan, I'll lend you money for 3%. And someone else will be like, no, Jordan, let me lend you money. Just give me 2%. You see, when there's strong demand, the interest rate is going to go down. It's going to be the same thing for treasuries. If there's strong demand for U.S. treasuries, then the interest rate's going to go down because people are willing to lend money at a lower rate. Now, let's just say that David Freeman says the same thing. I need some people to lend me some money. I'm telling you, you're not going to get the same reaction as Jordan. Like, do you know who David Freeman is? No? Well, I mean, I don't know him either. I never heard of David Freeman in my life. So if David Freeman asks people to lend him money, people are going to be like, no, I'm not going to lend you money. You know, some people are going to be like, David, I'll lend you money if you pay me an interest rate of 15% because I don't know who the hell you are. So you see, when there's less demand, then the interest rate's going to go up. Interest rates need to go up in order to incentivize people to lend money to you. Now, I'm telling you, it's going to be the same thing with U.S. Treasuries. If there's fewer people transacting in dollars, then there's going to be less demand for U.S. Treasuries, which means that interest rates will go up. And that's going to be terrible news for the U.S. government, who's in debts by $39 trillion. And that's going to be bad for Americans that are looking to get a mortgage or auto loan or student loans or whatever it may be. So ultimately, what is going on with the world? They're transacting less in dollars. China, Russia, Iran, BRICS. They're saving less in dollars, so there's less demand for dollars. And when there's less demand for dollars, the currency becomes even more devalued. So we're talking about less purchasing power for Americans and for our governments, which means a lower standard of living. And that's the consequence of de-dollarization. Now, let me ask you a question. Do you have aspirations to become poorer in the future? Like, if you don't want to become poorer for you and your family, then you should ask the question, how do I protect myself from de-dollarization? And I'll tell you, there's many ways to do it, but in my opinion, I believe the best way to do it is to buy gold to protect yourself. You can buy physical gold, which I've done. You can buy gold on the stock markets, which I've done. Or you can buy gold stocks. There's gold miners, there's gold royalty companies, there's gold streaming companies, which I've done too. Okay, why gold? It's because that's where the demand is going. Look at the central banks. Like, you know, the people with the money printers. And the best part is, of course, they can't print gold. I'm going to end with this. If you want to see what I'm specifically investing in, come join.
Yeah, you know, everyone's trying to find a solution to basically escape Yahweh Bashimal Shah's judgment. But at the end of the day, all we have is Yahweh Bashimal Shah. So again, this is just more things going on behind the scenes. You know, it's just a thing of us connecting the dots. Because again, when this thing spills over, when this debt bubble pops, man, I said this before, the amount of people deleting themselves, jumping off those high-rise buildings, you know, people living above their means, right? Yahweh Bashimal Shai, he's removing all the comforts. So just get ready to more and more feel the squeeze, feel the pressure. Habakkuk 2:6. Shall not all these take up a parable against him and a taunting proverb against him? And we're in that time now. America is a taunting proverb. Woe to him that increaseth that which is not his. How long? And to him that ladeth himself with thick clay, going into that debt. So we built this whole system off of debt. And as I mentioned yesterday, you know, going into those balances, man, unjust weights, that's off. So being that this whole system is built off of unjust balances and weights, is built off of debt, well, again, you can only kick the can down the road for so long. This road is about to come to an end because this debt bubble, when it pops, is about to pop. And when it does, hey, anarchy, chaos, and so on and so forth. So just more information, dealing with how the dollar, is losing its purchasing power and things of that nature. People think it's bad now. We haven't seen anything yet. All right. Hyperinflation, as the scriptures talk about, neighbor against neighbor, is going to get crucial out here. So, Lord willing, this was edifying. Shalom to thee, hopefully elect.